I wanted to start by just explaining the title, which is Betraying Big Brother. And that was actually part of an account written by Wei Tingting, who is one of the Feminist Five, and they make up the core of the narrative of this book. But what happened was that in 2015, there were a rather large group of feminist activists all across China who were planning to commemorate International Women's Day on March 8th by handing out anti-sexual harassment stickers on subways and buses. But before they were even able to carry out that activity, the Chinese police launched a really sweeping round of arrests in multiple cities. Arrested these feminist activists, held them for about 24 hours, and ended up focusing on 5 young women and bringing them from Hangzhou, Guangzhou, and Beijing to the same detention center in Beijing where they were held for 37 days. And in an online account of her initial experience with detention, one of the Feminist Five described, and that's Wei Tingting, who's actually this on the cover right here. She described being overcome with a sense of terror and powerlessness because the first thing that the security agents did when they detained all of these women, 4 of the 5 women wore glasses, and they confiscated the glasses so that the women were completely disoriented. And Wei Tingting herself is almost blind without her glasses. She couldn't see anything. And so she was in this small cell by herself. It was the middle of winter, and there was absolutely no heat. They had taken her very warm winter coat. They had also confiscated her snow boots, and then just left there by herself. And before she was just completely consumed with this feeling of terror, she started to hear the voices of some of her fellow feminist activists beyond the walls of her cell. And she put her ear up against the wall of the cell. And then when she recognized some of her feminist sisters, she started singing out loud so that they could hear her and know that they weren't alone. And then some of them started singing back to her as well. And one of the songs that they sang is an anthem of the feminist movement, which is called A Song for All Women. And I don't actually have the words in front of me. But when Wei Tingting heard the singing from beyond the walls of her cell, that's when she regained her sense of hope and defiance. And she said she experienced the joy of betraying Big Brother. So that's where the title of the book comes from. Here are the 5 women. They're at the core of the narrative of the book, but really the book is about a phenomenon much larger than these 5 young women. But I regard the jailing of these women in 2015 as a very important turning point for women's rights in China, and particularly for the history of the resistance of women in China. Before they were jailed, these feminist activists in China they had carried out acts of what they called performance art, and they deliberately avoided the use of the term protest because they wanted to avoid appearing to be too confrontational. So these are, I don't think I need to give you the names of everybody there, but here are a couple of examples of the kinds of performance art that these feminist activists were engaged in. In 2012, if you see the picture on the top, this activity was called 受伤新娘, or Bloody Brides, and 3 young women donned these white wedding gowns that were stained with fake red blood just to protest the epidemic of domestic violence in China. And they're carrying these signs like, love is no excuse for violence. This is an incredibly provocative display where they paraded down in the Tiananmen area of Beijing. And that was one example of the kinds of performance art they are engaged in. Another one was, the one below was in Guangzhou, and they called it Occupy Men's Toilets. And that was just a really innocuous, politically innocuous cause, drawing attention to the fact that there aren't enough toilets for women. And so they chose these kinds of issues that the Chinese government would not find politically problematic. And in fact, the Occupy Men's Toilets action attracted a lot of positive media coverage, including in Xinhua News. So what they did here was take over a men's public bathroom and ask the men to vacate the stalls and allow women to use the stalls just for an hour, just to highlight the fact that, you know, women have to stand in line for much longer than men. But the activists always chose issues that they didn't think could ever be considered politically sensitive. So that was why it was such a huge shock when these 5 young women were actually jailed in 2015 just for planning to hand out anti-sexual harassment stickers. And they didn't even get to actually carry out the activity. So when the government jailed these 5 young women, let me see if I can get this right. Yes. The government pretty clearly thought that in jailing these 5 young women, it would be able to just eradicate the possibility of a large-scale feminist movement, which they had started to become concerned about. And up until that point, the activists really never got into trouble. A couple of them had been lightly questioned by police from time to time, but it wasn't anything serious. But in arresting the 5 young women, the government kind of lit a spark that just rapidly became out of control. It just angered so many people in the feminist community. They hadn't really been that serious before. It was really a kind of small number, around 100 young women prior to this time, who were carrying out these kind of isolated events that were more imaginative and theatrical than anything else. But in jailing the women, it actually provoked an enormous global outcry. So I give you the example of a tweet from Hillary Clinton, who was at that time considered to be the front runner to be the US president. And she said, "See hosting a meeting on women's rights at the UN while persecuting feminists, shameless." And she was referring to the fact that Xi Jinping was about to co-host a World Women's Conference at the UN in New York to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Beijing World Conference on Women, held in 1995. And it was at that conference that Hillary Clinton gave this really famous speech where she says women's rights are human rights. She was just one of the world leaders who condemned the jailing of these young women. There was a lot of other heads of state or representatives of foreign governments were complaining about the move. There was also a global hashtag campaign called Free the Five in a lot of countries. There were protests, people protesting in a lot of different cities around the world, demanding that the Chinese government release the 5 women. They received a huge amount of news coverage. And so that was outside China. But inside China, the feminist activists also came up with their own campaign of solidarity for the Feminist Five, or in Chinese, it's the 女权五姐妹, the Feminist Five Sisters. And what they did was, on the first day of detention, they posted this picture, which is of 5 young women wearing the masks of the Feminist Five, posing in this picture that could be from the Beatles' Abbey Road album. And the whole idea was each day they would say day 2, day 3 of the detention of the feminist activists, and they would show 5 women wearing the masks of the Feminist Five in public spaces, enjoying freedom of movement, enjoying a life of freedom in the outside world, when in fact the real Feminist Five were imprisoned. And so each day they posted one of these pictures. There were a lot of other people inside China who joined in this solidarity campaign. It wasn't just feminist activists. There were also lawyers. There were even factory workers, because one of the Feminist Five in Guangzhou, Zheng Churan, had had a years-long record of involvement in the labor rights movement, and she had done a lot to help male factory workers as well as factory women through a lot of different campaigns, just advocating for workers' rights. And so you also had male workers joining in and saying, you know, free the Feminist Five in China. Now, of course, in China, because of the heavy internet censorship, a lot of those images were all taken down really quickly. But I strongly believe that it was because of this huge global outcry that the government decided it really wasn't worth it to actually criminally prosecute the women. It looked as though the 5 women were going to jail. They were going to be charged with some aspect of disturbing the social order. But then very suddenly, after 37 days of detention, they were released, which is really quite unprecedented in China. And I think it shows you the importance of speaking out against injustice inside China. So I want to very briefly introduce you to this idea. I have a chapter in the book called China's Patriarchal Authoritarianism. And a lot of people, when they're looking at the longevity of the Communist Party in China and why is it that the party's been able to stay in power in spite of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism across Eastern Europe, what is it that has enabled the party to hold on to power and become the world's longest lasting communist regime, which it has become now. It's outlasted the Soviet Union. But I think that it's absolutely critical to look at the role of gender, that the patriarchal nature of authoritarian control is just absolutely essential. The subjugation of women in many, many different ways is a central feature of the male-dominated party's control of the entire population in China. And in particular, you see that since the onset of market reforms over the last few decades, with a huge resurgence of traditional gender norms and a lot of propaganda being very aggressively pushed by the party, pushing particularly educated women to return to the home and become dutiful wives and mothers. And that coincides with the changing of the so-called one-child policy, which lasted for over 35 years. But at the end of 2015, the government announced that it was now going to have an official two-child policy. So along with that, there's been a new kind of propaganda that has intensified this pushing of women into these very submissive roles of wife and mother. And it's against that backdrop of rapidly rising gender inequality, which I've written a lot about in my first book as well as the second. But it's against that backdrop that feminism becomes to be seen as a threat by the Communist Party. So here's an example of some of the propaganda presenting Xi Jinping and the personality cult around Xi Jinping that a lot of people have written about. in 2017, they introduced this notion of 家国天下, or family state under heaven. And it's really presenting the kinds of images of a strong man, authoritarian ruler, presiding over hundreds of millions of male-dominated families. And the family is absolutely central to this, where everybody is supposed to play their correct role within the family, where the man is the head, the boss of the household, and he goes out, makes the money, while the woman is supposed to take care of internal family affairs, to raise children, and take care of the elderly. And that is seen as a harmonious family that is at the center of the harmonious society which builds a strong sovereign nation. So there was a long article in Xinhua News in March of 2017 all about this idea of the family state under heaven and family values. And this is a quote from that article. Xi stresses the importance of family values. He says little family, 小家, but he has in mind the big family, 国家, and 家 means family. So the compound word 国家 means nation state, but Xinhua goes to extreme lengths to emphasize the importance of the notion of family in the nation state of China. And so when the family is harmonious, family being a marriage between a man and a woman resulting in a child or two or more, when the family is stable, then the nation state is stable. And it's really striking how many parallels there are with hundreds of years old Confucian didactic texts about womanly virtues. And here's just one example from the Qing Dynasty, biographies of exemplary women. Quote, the daughter obeys her parents, the daughter-in-law reverently serves her parents-in-law, the wife assists her husband, the mother guides her sons and daughters. When every family is harmonious, the state is well governed. So, and if you look at the pictures themselves, they present, this is actually kind of from a video which gives Xi Jinping this kind of hagiographic glow. And you can see a little bit of it, that light trailing, the magical kind of light following him around as though he were a god. And he's carrying his daughter on the back of his bike, so he's being the responsible father on top. But this is even more important. Below, he's holding the hand of his aging mother, and he's playing the role of the very dutiful filial son who's taking care of his elders, his mother. And so family is presented in Communist Party propaganda as being a critical component of maintaining political stability. So let's look more at the personality cult around Xi Jinping, which a lot of people have written about, but it's also less written about is the fact that it's a hyper-masculine personality cult. And for example, he was given the moniker Xi Dada until sometime in mid-2016 when the party thought that maybe that personality cult had gone too far, and so they urged state media to stop using the term. But Xi Dada is a little bit like Big Daddy Xi. And there were a lot of hip-hop songs that came around just eulogizing the hyper-masculine Xi Dada. And this one, that's a screen grab from the song, If You Want to Marry someone like Xi Dada. And there he is, the manly president, surveilling the troops, the PLA at Tiananmen Square. And it's also interesting to note that in Xi Jinping's very first important speech as General Secretary of the Communist Party, given in January 2013, he talked at length about why the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is something that really obsesses the Communist Party, is how do we avoid the fate of the Soviet Communist Party? And this one quote from that speech says, "The Soviet Communist Party had more members than we do, but nobody was man enough to stand up and resist." So the implication is that Xi Jinping himself is manly. He is going to be the manly ruler who will save China and protect China from all of these perceived threats coming from the outside, from these so-called hostile Western forces that are bent on interfering in China's affairs and bringing down the Communist Party. So in all of this propaganda, you have continually the presentation of, well, you have very hyper-masculine presentations of men. There are also some new schools for boys, teaching them how to be more masculine so they can grow up and defend the nation. And then on the other side, you have very virtuous, docile images of women. And that kind of propaganda has really intensified, particularly under Xi Jinping. And it's quite striking how when the propaganda talks about, developing China and making China a strong nation, there's almost no mention of the importance of working women to China's future economic growth. That's in marked contrast to the propaganda in the early communist era, where women were often presented in these kind of masculine roles, like driving a bulldozer or being a welder, that women were seen as, well, as Mao Zedong said, women hold up half the sky. And the government assigned women jobs in the cities and in the countryside. But all of that has been undone, particularly in the last couple of decades, and especially in the last few years under Xi Jinping. So the emphasis is much more on women needing to play a very traditional, virtuous role. I think I'm going to skip over this so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. There was just very briefly in 2007, the State Council issued a population decision that warned about the low quality of the Chinese population, and said it was an urgent priority to raise the quality of the Chinese population in order to make it easier for China to meet the requirements of fierce competition for national strength. So this idea of the quality of the population and trying to raise it is really important when you're thinking about the mass matchmaking that's going on now, and targeting particularly educated Han Chinese young women, trying to push them into getting married early and having 2 babies now, because that has been the focus for the last couple of years. So this is an example of the new kinds of very aggressive propaganda aimed at particularly educated women, or women who are still in college even. This was at the end of 2015, and it coincided with the announcement that the government was going to get rid of the so-called one-child policy and encourage everybody to have 2 babies. And the headline for this People's Daily article was "Female University Students with Babies, Brighter Job Prospects, Student Moms on the Rise." And it was a long article that was just, I think, pure propaganda. It was certainly unscientific, although they claim to cite all of this data showing that when women are, or when college women or or even women in master's programs are preparing to enter the job market, that they have a much better chance of getting hired if they're already married and already have had their babies. And so it's a very bizarre kind of propaganda. And it does actually speak as well to the legacy from the communist era. There's such a strong legacy of women working, because almost all women used to work in China in the early communist era. So that sense of that work ethic is still very strong, even as the party is trying to undo that. But if you look at this image, and it looks like it's right from Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, about a fictitious country where fertility rates have plummeted, and so the remaining young fertile women are all taken and enslaved so that they can have sex and have babies for the good of the country. But this is actually a real picture that they used in the People's Daily, and the focus is all on the baby. You can't even see any facial features or anything with the mother, except for the mortarboard on her head, which indicates that she went to college at least. So all of that pro-marriage, pro-natalist propaganda is really targeting educated women and Han women. Here's another article from the People's Daily Online from 2017 with the headline, "You'd better believe it, under 30 are women's best years for getting pregnant." So this is actually aimed at college women. I mean, they could be even teenagers. Another quote or subheading from the article is, "Female university students' joyful love. Freshman year, live together. Sophomore year, get pregnant. Junior year, have baby." So it's just kind of hard to believe, but this really is what they were pushing in this particular People's Daily article. And if you look at the images, these are a bunch of very attractive, made up, new college or master's graduates all oohing and aahing around the baby carriage. And then on the right, there's a new graduate who's already got a toddler in one arm, and then with the other arm, she's resting it on her very visibly pregnant belly with her second child already on the way. So she's doing her patriotic thing, and she's so beautiful and happy. So this is the kind of example of this. These are not coercive. I mean, they're just presenting the model of motherhood and educated women then choosing to have their babies, to marry, have their babies, and then focus on raising children. And of course, the backdrop to that is the fact that birth rates have been plummeting in China. And just a few days ago, there were new official statistics on births in 2018 showing a really stunning decline. And one demographer said that it was the lowest number of births in China since the famine of 1961, which is just stunning. So the government is extremely alarmed about the plummeting birth rates. And of course, along with that, you have a severely aging population in China and a shrinking workforce. And as economic growth slows and will continue to slow, these changing demographics bode quite ill for China's future. And so the government has also said that it's going to adopt new measures to encourage more couples to have more babies and show how it's such a good thing. There was also a new news report about a couple of Chinese companies who are offering Single women over 30 dating leave, so they get an extra, I think, 8 days of vacation over the Lunar New Year holiday so they can date and find the right husband. I really don't know how effective that's going to be, but so here's another example of the kinds of new traditional virtuous woman that the government is trying to push. In March of 2018, the All China Women's Federation in Zhenjiang and Jiangsu promoted these courses that they called New Era Women. And New Era is, of course, the catchphrase for the Xi Jinping era. But the woman of the new era is being taught to raise her quality, 提高素质, through classes on posture, grooming, and makeup according to traditional Chinese culture. And this is an actual photograph of the courses where the instructor is showing the young women how to sit and cross their legs perfectly. And this quote on the left it's a little bit old, but it's still so just right and worth reading. This is from 2011. Pretty girls don't need a lot of education to marry into a rich and powerful family, but girls with an average or ugly appearance will find it difficult. These kinds of girls hope to further their education in order to increase their competitiveness. The tragedy is they don't realize that as women age, they are worth less and less. So by the time they get their MA or PhD, they are already old, like yellowed pearls. So it's this steady barrage of extremely sexist, insulting language and imagery, specifically targeting women who have the audacity to continue their educations beyond the college level. It's important to note that population engineering in China is not just about increasing the total birth rate, because as probably everybody here is aware, in Xinjiang now you have the mass internment of Uyghur Muslims. And you have reports that there are around 1 million Uyghurs interned right now. But even before the mass internment of Uyghurs started, there was a lot of language in the state media about the, quote, worryingly high birth rates and rapid population growth in Xinjiang, which is the complete opposite of the message that the Chinese government is sending about the rest of China, where it is extremely alarmed about the low birth rates among, of course, the majority Han Chinese population. So it's just another example of how the population engineering is not just about quantity of babies, it's about perceived quality, and the Uyghur Muslims are perceived as not being good quality. And here's another piece from 2015. There was a Xinjiang official who said that the high birth rates in Xinjiang negatively affects population quality in the region, posing risks to social stability. And then in 2017 in Xinjiang, they got rid of the decades-long policy for ethnic minorities. It wasn't just Uyghurs, it was all ethnic minorities were for many decades allowed to have one child more than Han Chinese families. And they just abolished that policy in 2017. And they said they did it for reasons of ethnic equality. But it's pretty clear that it's a kind of population engineering, or, you could call it, some people could call it definitely social engineering or cultural genocide. So coming back to the feminist movement, all of the other things that I presented to you are just to give you the backdrop against which this incredibly vibrant, resilient women's rights movement has grown. It's sprung up, and rather than being wiped out by the Chinese government, it is actually continuing to grow in spite of all of these intense obstacles, in spite of this very heavy internet censorship, where feminism itself becomes a taboo keyword on the internet, and is the hashtag #MeToo has also become very politically sensitive and subject to just waves of censorship. And last year, on the night of International Women's Day, the most influential feminist social media account, Feminist Voices, or 女权之声, was banned on Weibo, and then the following day it was banned on Weixin. So at the time I thought that would be, that was certainly a huge blow to the feminist movement, because that was a major conduit for the distribution of feminist essays and thought. But in spite of that, the feminist movement continues, and after Feminist Voices was banned, the Me Too movement really took off. And in April, there were thousands of university students at dozens of universities across China and including men, not just women, who were signing these petitions or open letters demanding that these universities address sexual harassment and introduce a mechanism for taking it seriously. And in fact, it forced the government to respond. So the Ministry of Education announced that it was going to be introducing nationwide regulations on sexual harassment. The government also said it was going to work on a new civil code on sexual harassment, which basically there isn't anything. There's just very vague language in existing Chinese law about sexual harassment, but there's no, real breakdown of what it is and how violators are supposed to be punished. So I really think that this broad women's rights movement is quite resilient and extraordinary, and it may have the potential, I think, to be the most transformative social movement in China since 1989. And not that I'm expecting millions of people to take to the streets, and hold women's marches, but the ways in which it is emerging, and social media is a main conduit for getting the messages out in spite of the heavy censorship, but also the activists are so creative and resilient that they continue to find ways to keep the momentum of the women's rights movement going, in spite of the continued intense persecution of individual feminist activists. And over the last few months, we've also seen that what was already somewhat cross-class in nature, some of the feminist activists had already had a history of being involved in labor rights as well, and advocating for workers, women and male workers' rights. That in the last few months we've seen a real attack on elite university students, including Peking University and other elite universities. These students who, some of them are very feminist, but they all are advocating for workers' rights, and they call themselves Marxists, and a lot of them have been detained. And I just read a report a couple of days ago saying that some of these activists have been recorded making confessions that are then being showed in classrooms at universities in China. But the thing is that the women's rights movement has become increasingly cross-class, where it's also involving women workers, male workers. There's also overlap with the LGBTQ rights movement. So it's really quite impressively intersectional for a social movement in China. One really important note is that in May of 2017, there was a People's Daily article online that was about a speech by the vice president of the All China Women's Federation, which laid out this idea that Western feminism was a real threat to China, and that, quote unquote, Western hostile forces are using Western feminism to interfere in China's handling of women's affairs. And so that line of questioning is often used when activists are detained or questioned about their feminism or their labor rights activism. It's, are you being used as a tool of Western hostile forces? Who told you to do this? You know that that is subversive. You could face criminal charges for that. So it doesn't bode well for the next few years, I think. But I still hold out a lot of hope because I look at these young activists and they are so determined. And they're so determined, and often when they get into trouble, if they're detained or questioned or punished or expelled from university, which has happened to at least one or two of the students, they become even more radicalized. So then the government resorts to, well, coming back to the family again, the family as a key force in maintaining political stability, that a lot of the parents of the young activists are then contacted by security agents. They bring the parents in to put pressure on their kids, to warn their kids not to take part in activism or to actively punish the young activists. And you see a lot of that happening. It's very disturbing. But I still think that women's rights in general, there is a kind of, as dire as the overall situation is politically in China, I think women's rights is kind of, for the time being anyway, a kind of bright spot that gives me a lot of hope. And not just in thinking about China, but in thinking about the rise of authoritarianism around the world, that we have a lot to learn from these young, incredibly brave, resilient women's rights activists in China. Thank you.